The first time my mother-in-law suggested my son didn't belong to her family, she did it while slicing strawberries at my kitchen counter. Not dramatically, not cruelly, at least not in the obvious way people imagine cruelty. Eleanor Whitmore never raised her voice when she wanted to hurt someone. Women like her rarely do. They learn very early that the quietest sentence in the room is often the one that leaves the deepest wound. She picked up one of the strawberries, examined it with mild disappointment, and said, "It's strange, isn't it? Noah doesn't look like Daniel did at that age." I remember exactly how the morning light looked when she said it. Pale February sunlight coming through the blinds in narrow silver stripes. The smell of coffee still lingering in the apartment. My son sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building a crooked tower from wooden blocks, while cartoons played softly in the background. He was 4 years old. 4. At that age, children still believe every adult who smiles at them is safe. I kept spreading cream cheese onto my toast very carefully because I had already learned something important about Eleanor during the 6 years I had been married to her son. The moment you reacted emotionally, she won. She fed on reactions the way some people feed on praise. "Most children change as they grow," I said evenly. She smiled then, small, controlled, almost elegant. "Yes," she replied, "but blood has a way of repeating itself." And there it was. Not accusation exactly, something far more sophisticated. A seed, a suggestion carefully planted in the room so she could later pretend she never placed it there at all. Daniel walked into the kitchen moments later, still buttoning his shirt for work, distracted and half awake in the way exhausted fathers often are. He kissed the top of my head automatically before pouring himself coffee. "What are we talking about?" he asked. "Genetics," Eleanor answered smoothly before I could speak. "Noah has such unusual features." Daniel glanced toward our son in the other room and shrugged. "He looks like Maya," he said. I should have felt defended by that sentence. Instead, something cold settled quietly into my stomach because of the way Eleanor's expression changed afterward. Not anger, not disappointment, interest, as if she had just discovered where the weakness in the wall might be. "My name is Maya Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and until 8 months ago, I believed my marriage was stable in the ordinary way stable marriages are. Not passionate every second, not cinematic, but built on routines that felt dependable. Morning coffee, shared grocery lists, Daniel rubbing circles against my back when I couldn't sleep. Small, ordinary tendernesses. The kind of life you stop examining closely because you assume it will continue exactly as it is. That was before Eleanor decided my son didn't belong to her family. Or maybe before she decided I didn't. The Whitmores were the kind of family that treated wealth less like money and more like inherited architecture. It surrounded everything. Their opinions, their expectations, the way they spoke to restaurant staff, the neighborhoods they considered acceptable, the schools they assumed children should attend. Daniel had grown up inside that world so completely that he barely noticed it anymore. I noticed it immediately. My father repaired elevators for 31 years. My mother worked reception at a dental office until arthritis made her hands too painful to continue. We were not poor, but we were careful. Careful with electricity, careful with groceries, careful with things that could not easily be replaced. The Whitmores replaced things constantly. Phones, cars, entire kitchens renovated because Eleanor became tired of a particular shade of marble. At first, Daniel loved what he called my grounded perspective. That's the phrase he used while we were dating. Grounded. As if my entire childhood had been a charming personality trait instead of a life. Then we got married. Then I became pregnant. Then Eleanor started looking at me differently, not openly hostile. That would have been easier. Eleanor specialized in a more exhausting kind of warfare, the kind built entirely from implication. You must find this neighborhood noisy after where you grew up. I suppose children adapt to smaller apartments. My goodness, Noah tans so quickly. Tiny comments, individually harmless, together corrosive. I told myself for years that I was imagining it. Women are trained to do that, especially women who enter rooms they suspect were not originally built for them. The first time Daniel defended his mother, truly defended her, was 3 months before the DNA test. And I remember that night with painful clarity because it was the first moment I understood something inside my marriage had quietly shifted without me noticing. It was raining outside, hard enough that water streaked violently across the windows of our apartment. Noah had already fallen asleep on the couch after refusing dinner, exhausted from preschool and a mild fever. Eleanor had spent the evening criticizing everything from the organic soup I bought to the fact that Noah still mixed up certain letters when reading. Then, while Daniel was loading dishes into the dishwasher, she looked directly at me and said softly, "You know, sometimes mothers are absolutely certain who their children belong to. Fathers only have trust." The room went completely still. Even the dishwasher seemed suddenly too loud. I stared at her. Daniel froze with a plate still in his hand, and for one impossible second, I truly believed he was finally going to tell her to leave. Instead, he sighed. Actually sighed. "Mum," he muttered tiredly. "Not tonight. Not outrage, not denial, not, 'How could you say that about my wife?' Just exhaustion, as though both of us were equally responsible for the poison she had dropped into the room. And that was the moment something began cracking quietly beneath my life. After that night, Eleanor stopped making direct comments for a while. That almost made it worse. Open hostility at least gives you something solid to react to. Silence doesn't. Silence spreads. It settles into rooms and dinners and ordinary conversations until you begin questioning whether the tension exists at all, or whether you've invented it because you're tired or sensitive, or imagining things again. And I did imagine things. Constantly. That's what subtle people count on. 3 weeks passed after the argument in our kitchen. March arrived with grey skies and freezing rain that turned the sidewalks outside our apartment into slick mirrors by morning. Noah caught another cold from preschool. Daniel started coming home later from work. And Eleanor became strangely attentive. Not kinder. Attentive. She started bringing Noah gifts every time she visited. Expensive educational toys still inside glossy packaging. Designer children's clothes with tiny embroidered logos I knew cost more than my winter coat growing up. She praised him constantly in front of Daniel. "My grandson is so intelligent. He has excellent posture. He's advanced for his age." The emphasis on my grandson never went unnoticed. It was theatre, deliberate and polished, and somehow that frightened me more than the insults had. One Saturday afternoon, I found her standing alone in Noah's bedroom while he napped beside her. She was looking at him with an expression I couldn't immediately understand. Not warmth, calculation. The curtains moved softly from the heat event, stirring the pale blue fabric beside the crib. Noah was asleep on his stomach with one arm tucked underneath his cheek, breathing heavily through the congestion still lingering from his cold. Eleanor didn't turn around when I entered. "Daniel slept exactly like this," she said quietly. I stayed near the doorway. "He's tired," I answered carefully. "Yes," she murmured. "Children become exhausted when adults keep secrets around them." A strange coldness moved through me. I remember gripping the door frame harder than necessary. "What does that mean?" Finally she looked at me and smiled. Again, That small, elegant smile that never reached her eyes. You always become defensive so quickly, Maya. I asked you a question, and I made an observation. Then she walked past me out of the room, wearing that faint, expensive perfume that somehow always lingered long after she left. I stood there listening to Noah breathe, and for the first time in my marriage, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Fear. Not fear that Daniel would leave me. Something worse. Fear that someone was carefully constructing a reality around me while I was still inside it. That night, after Noah fell asleep, I finally confronted Daniel directly. Our apartment was quiet except for the hum of traffic below the windows and the occasional rattle from the old radiator beside the couch. Daniel sat at the kitchen island answering emails on his laptop, while half-finished takeout containers crowded the counter between us. I watched him for almost a full minute before speaking. "Your mother needs to stop." He didn't look up immediately. "Stop what?" "You know exactly what." Now he sighed. Again that exhausted sigh. Not confusion, not outrage, fatigue, as though this conversation had become inconvenient for him long before it became unbearable for me. "Maya," he said carefully, "my mother says strange things sometimes. That's just who she is." I laughed once under my breath because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. "She implied Noah isn't yours." "She didn't say that." "She absolutely said that." "She implied something," he corrected quietly. "There's a difference." That sentence changed something fundamental inside me, because suddenly I understood the real problem wasn't Eleanor. It was Daniel's need to survive her. People who grow up around manipulative personalities develop strange emotional reflexes. They learn that minimizing damage is easier than confronting it, easier to smooth things over, easier to reinterpret cruelty into misunderstanding. I had spent 6 years assuming Daniel's calmness meant emotional maturity. Now I realized it might simply mean adaptation. "You know what the difference is between implication and accusation?" I asked softly. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Maya, the difference is deniability." Silence stretched between us. Rain tapped steadily against the windows. Finally he closed the laptop. "What do you want me to do?" I stared at him, and that question hurt more than anything Eleanor had ever said, because he genuinely didn't know. I wanted him to defend me without being instructed how. I wanted him to look at his mother and recognize cruelty without needing it translated. I wanted my marriage to feel like a marriage instead of a negotiation happening around someone else's emotional damage. Instead, I said quietly, "I want your mother to stop talking about Noah like he's evidence in a courtroom." Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds. Then he said the sentence that replayed in my head for months afterward. "She just wants certainty." The room went completely still. I remember hearing the refrigerator motor click on in the silence. "What?" "She's old-fashioned," he said quickly, avoiding my eyes now. "She believes family blood matters." Family blood, not trust, not love. Blood. I felt something inside me become very calm, dangerously calm. "So, your mother thinks there's a possibility Noah isn't your son?" Daniel immediately shook his head. "No. God, Maya, that's not what I'm saying. But it's what she's saying. She's paranoid. And you're defending it. I'm trying to keep peace in this family." There it was. The real truth. Not justice. Not loyalty. Peace. The kind of peace people protect when they're terrified of conflict, even if maintaining it slowly destroys everyone around them. I looked at my husband sitting across from me beneath the soft kitchen lights and realized something devastating. He wasn't choosing between me and his mother. He had already chosen years ago, and I had simply mistaken his silence for neutrality. The DNA test became Eleanor's idea 3 weeks later. Of course it did. Women like her rarely attack directly when they can engineer someone else into volunteering for their own humiliation. That was her real talent. Not cruelty itself. Orchestrating circumstances until cruelty appeared reasonable. It happened during Easter brunch at her house. The Whitmore family home sat on the northern edge of the city, behind iron gates and rows of carefully sculpted hedges that looked expensive to maintain and emotionally exhausting to live behind. The house itself was enormous in the quiet old money way that avoided obvious displays of wealth while somehow making everything around it feel smaller. Even after 7 years, entering that house still made me feel as though I needed to apologize for bringing weather in with me. The dining room smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Eleanor believed fresh flowers should always be visible during meals because a civilized home must look alive. That afternoon, pale white arrangements stretched across the center of the table between silver serving dishes and crystal glasses nobody was allowed to place too close to the edge. Daniel sat beside me, distracted by work emails under the table. Noah was excited because Eleanor had organized an elaborate Easter egg hunt in the backyard, and Eleanor herself moved through the room with the calm precision of someone preparing a stage before the audience realizes the performance has begun. I should have recognized it earlier. That's the strange thing about manipulation. Looking backward, the pattern becomes obvious. While you're inside it, every individual moment seems too small to justify alarm. Lunch had nearly ended when Eleanor placed her wine glass down gently and said, "I read something interesting this week about modern DNA testing." The sentence entered the room softly, almost casually, but I felt my entire body tense before anyone else reacted. Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "Mom." "No, really," she continued smoothly. "It's incredible now, completely accurate. Families use it for medical history all the time." Across the table, Daniel's older brother Mark immediately became uncomfortable. I noticed because, unlike Daniel, Mark had never fully adapted to his mother's methods. He saw them. He simply lacked the courage to confront them consistently. "That's probably enough," he muttered quietly. Eleanor ignored him. She looked directly at Noah instead. "Wouldn't it be wonderful," she said lightly, "to know exactly where all our traits come from?" Noah smiled because children assume adults are talking about something safe until proven otherwise. "I got my eyes from Mommy," he announced proudly. Eleanor's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Yes," she said. "Perhaps you did." The silence that followed was microscopic, barely noticeable, but every adult at the table felt it. I looked at Daniel, waiting. Surely this was the moment he finally understood how grotesque this had become. Instead, he rubbed his forehead tiredly and whispered, "Mum, please." Again, please, not stop, not enough. Please, a request for comfort, for reduced tension, never accountability. I suddenly realized Eleanor understood something about her son that I had refused to fully accept. He would always prioritize emotional stability over truth, even if the stability itself was poisoned. Eleanor leaned back in her chair gracefully. "I don't understand why everyone becomes so sensitive whenever I mention science." "Because you're implying Maya cheated on Daniel," Mark snapped suddenly. The room froze. Eleanor blinked once slowly, genuinely offended now that someone had translated her implications into plain English. "I said no such thing." "But that's what you mean." "How ugly," she murmured, "for you to project something so vulgar onto a simple conversation." That was her genius. By refusing to speak directly, she forced everyone else to become the aggressor for her. Daniel finally put his phone down. "Can we not do this today?" I stared at him in disbelief. "Do this." as though all of us had collectively created the situation together, as though his mother was not calmly dismantling my dignity, one implication at a time, while he negotiated the tone instead of the behavior. Noah looked between us, confused now. Children always know when adults are lying emotionally, even before they understand language fully. "Mummy?" he asked softly. I forced myself to smile immediately. "It's okay, baby." But it wasn't okay. Something irreversible had entered the room, and everyone knew it. The rest of brunch passed under a layer of artificial politeness so dense it became physically exhausting. Eleanor discussed charity events. Mark drank too much wine too quickly. Daniel avoided eye contact with everyone. I spent most of the meal watching Noah colour quietly beside the window. At one point, he held up a drawing proudly. 3 stick figures holding hands. Me, him, Daniel. No Eleanor. Something about that nearly broke my heart. We left just before sunset. Rain clouds had started gathering over the city again, turning the sky the colour of bruised metal. Noah fell asleep in the back seat within 10 minutes, clutching a plastic Easter rabbit Eleanor had given him. Daniel drove silently. I watched the city lights smear across the wet windows while anger slowly hardened into something more focused. Finally, I said quietly, "If you don't stop this, she's never going to stop." Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "She's old. That's not an excuse. She grew up differently. So did millions of people who don't accuse their daughters-in-law of cheating. She didn't accuse you." There it was again. The technicality. The desperate legalistic passing of cruelty into acceptable pieces. I turned toward the window because suddenly I understood this conversation wasn't about convincing him anymore. It was about measuring how alone I actually was. A few minutes later, Daniel spoke again. "What if we just did the test?" The words landed so softly I almost thought I'd imagined them. I turned slowly. "What?" He looked exhausted already. "Just to end this." For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't breathe correctly. Not because I doubted Noah, because my husband had just asked me to prove my innocence inside a crime I had never committed. I stared at him, and something inside me went completely, terrifyingly quiet. For 2 days after the drive home from Eleanor's house, I barely spoke to Daniel unless Noah was present. Not intentionally at first. I simply didn't know how to talk to someone who had calmly asked me to prove I hadn't betrayed him. The apartment itself seemed different afterward, smaller somehow, as if the walls had absorbed the conversation and were quietly replaying it back at me every time I entered a room. Daniel noticed the distance immediately. Of course he did. People like Daniel always notice emotional withdrawal once it affects them personally. What they often fail to notice is the long sequence of smaller injuries that created it. By Tuesday night, he finally confronted me. I was folding Noah's laundry in the bedroom while soft rain tapped against the windows again. The weather that spring seemed permanently trapped between storms. Tiny socks and dinosaur pajamas lay stacked neatly across the bed beside me, while a true crime documentary played quietly from my laptop for background noise I wasn't really listening to. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me for several seconds before speaking. "You're still angry." I didn't look up. That's an interesting way to describe this situation. "Maya?" "No, actually," I interrupted softly, folding one of Noah's shirts with almost painful precision. "Let's describe it accurately for once." He crossed his arms immediately. Defensive posture, learned behavior. "You know I don't think Noah isn't mine." The sentence itself nearly made me laugh from exhaustion. Because somehow we had reached a point where my husband expected credit for believing his own child belonged to him. That's a very low standard for loyalty, Daniel. I was trying to solve the problem. No, You were trying to make your mother comfortable. His jaw tightened slightly. She's family. The moment he said it, he realized the mistake. I looked up slowly. So am I. Silence. Heavy and immediate. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when cornered emotionally. You know that's not what I meant. Then explain what you meant. He opened his mouth. Stopped. Tried again. She's older, Maya. She gets things in her head and everyone rearranges reality around her so she doesn't have to face consequences. That's unfair. No, I said quietly. What's unfair is asking me to medically validate my fidelity because your mother enjoys emotional terrorism. His expression changed then. Not anger. Worse. Discomfort. The discomfort of someone being forced to examine a truth they've spent years avoiding. You're exaggerating. I stared at him in disbelief. Then suddenly something inside me snapped into clarity. Not rage, clarity. I put down the shirt in my hands very carefully and said, "Okay." Daniel blinked. "Okay what?" "Let's do the test." The entire room became still. Even I could hear how calm my own voice sounded. Daniel looked relieved too quickly, and that hurt more than I expected. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Maya?" "But we do it publicly." Now confusion crossed his face. "What?" "We do it with your mother present, since she's the one so concerned about bloodlines. That's unnecessary." "No," I said evenly. "What's unnecessary is accusing me of cheating for 6 months. But apparently we're doing unnecessary things now." "She never directly accused." "Stop!" My voice remained calm, but sharp enough that he finally fell silent. "If you finish that sentence again, I think something in this marriage will permanently break." That finally reached him. I saw it happen physically. Daniel looked away first. People always look away when truth enters the room too clearly. "I'll talk to her," he muttered. "No," I replied immediately. "Don't." He frowned. "I thought you wanted this resolved." "I do." "Then why wouldn't I talk to her?" Because suddenly I understood something important. If Daniel spoke to Eleanor privately first, she would reshape the narrative before the test even happened. She would become wounded, misunderstood, concerned only for family truth. Somehow I would still become the unreasonable one. Women like Eleanor survive through preemptive emotional editing. "No private conversations," I said firmly. "No warning her, no preparing the room before I walk into it." Daniel looked genuinely exhausted now. "This is becoming ridiculous." I almost smiled. Ridiculous? As though we had somehow both arrived equally at this madness together. "When did she first suggest it to you?" His eyes moved instantly. Too fast. And there it was. The answer before the answer. My stomach tightened. "Daniel." He exhaled heavily. "A few weeks ago." "How many weeks?" Silence. Then quietly. "Before Easter." I felt cold all over. So while I had still been trying to convince myself I was imagining Eleanor's behavior, she had already been privately discussing paternity testing with my husband. Behind my back. Inside my marriage. "How long were you considering it?" "I wasn't considering." "How long?" He looked down at the floor, and that was enough. I remember standing there beside folded children's clothes, while something almost impossible settled inside me. Not heartbreak. Heartbreak is loud. This was quieter. The slow death of trust. I suddenly understood that the DNA test itself no longer mattered. The damage had already happened the moment my husband allowed another person to place suspicion between us and call it reasonable. Daniel stepped closer carefully. "Maya, listen to me." "No," I whispered. And for the first time since we met, my husband looked afraid of me. Not because I raised my voice, because I didn't. "I need you to understand something very clearly," I said. "If we do this test, And it proves exactly what I already know it will prove. Your mother does not get to quietly move on afterward. She's still my mother, and I'm still your wife. Another silence. Then I said the thing I hadn't admitted even to myself yet. If Eleanor wants proof so badly, then I want to know why. Daniel froze, only for a second, but I saw it, and suddenly every instinct inside me began screaming the same terrifying thought. He knew something. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in almost 2 years. Not because I was physically ill, because I needed silence long enough to think clearly. After Daniel left for the office and Noah went to preschool, the apartment finally became still in that strange weekday way cities rarely allow. No cartoons in the background, no coffee machine humming, no elevator sounds from the hallway outside our unit. Just rain against glass. I sat at the kitchen table wearing an oversized sweater and staring at my untouched tea while the same thought kept circling through my head over and over again. He knew something, or at least feared something, and there is a very specific kind of terror that appears when the person you trust most begins behaving like someone trying to manage information instead of share it. By 11:30, I had convinced myself I was spiraling. By noon, I had almost convinced myself to apologize to Daniel for overreacting. Then Eleanor called me. I watched her name appear on my phone screen for nearly 10 seconds before answering. Hello? Maya? Her voice sounded smooth as silk, controlled, almost warm. I hope I'm not interrupting. That alone immediately put me on edge. Eleanor never called just to talk. No, I said carefully. What do you need? A tiny pause. Not long enough for most people to notice. Long enough for me. I wanted to check on you. I almost laughed. The concern in her voice was so expertly performed it became unsettling. I'm fine. Daniel said you were upset after brunch. Of course, he told her. The realization settled into me slowly and unpleasantly, like cold water filling shoes. So after I specifically asked him not to discuss it privately with her, he had done exactly that. Something inside me hardened further. I think anyone would be upset, I replied evenly, after being accused of infidelity in front of their child. Immediately she sighed softly, and there it was, the performance beginning. Maya, darling, no one accused you of anything. The calmness in her voice was almost more offensive than the accusation itself. I stood up from the table and walked toward the window overlooking the street below. Tiny black umbrellas moved through the rain like insects from 14 floors up. Then why does your son think a DNA test is necessary? Silence. Tiny, measured. Then, Daniel suggested that? The false surprise was flawless. If I hadn't spent years around her, I might have believed it. You discussed it with him before Easter. Another pause, and this time I heard it. A microscopic shift in breathing. A mistake. You seem very emotional today, Eleanor said gently. Not denial, redirection. Classic Eleanor. I closed my eyes briefly. Did you or did you not discuss paternity testing with my husband before Easter? When she answered, her voice had cooled several degrees. I simply expressed concern. Concern. Such a beautiful word for cruelty. And what exactly concerns you? That little boy doesn't resemble the Whitmores. I felt my pulse slow. Oddly, that was the moment anger disappeared entirely, because finally, she had said it directly. No implication, no elegant manipulation, just naked ugliness. He resembles me, I said quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied. Exactly. The silence after that felt enormous. I looked out over the grey city while something deeply uncomfortable settled into place inside my mind. This was never really about Noah. Not completely. It was about me, my background, my family, my place inside theirs. Eleanor didn't see Noah as suspicious because of his features. She saw him as suspicious because he carried evidence of me. "You never wanted me in this family," I said softly. For the first time since the conversation began, Eleanor stopped sounding composed. "I accepted you." "No," I replied. "You tolerated me because Daniel insisted. That's unfair. Again unfair. Interesting how people who weaponize humiliation become obsessed with fairness the moment you describe their behavior accurately. You think I trapped your son?" I continued quietly. "You think someone like me saw money and attached herself to your family. That is not what I said, but it is what you believe." Eleanor became silent again, and that silence confirmed more than words could have. I rested one hand against the cold window glass. When did this start? What? This obsession. When did you first decide Noah wasn't Daniel's? Her answer came too quickly this time. The timeline never made sense. Everything inside me froze. Timeline, not appearance, not features, timeline. Suddenly I was back 3 years earlier, sitting in our old apartment bathroom, holding a positive pregnancy test, while Daniel stared at it in shock beside me. We had conceived Noah only weeks after our wedding. Too soon for Eleanor. Too convenient. I spoke very carefully now. "What timeline?" Another pause. Then she realized what she'd revealed, and changed direction immediately. "You're misunderstanding me." "No," I whispered. "I think I'm finally understanding you perfectly." I heard movement on her end of the line. Ice clinking softly against crystal. Eleanor always drank sparkling water from expensive crystal glasses, even when alone. "I only want what's best for my son." There it is. What? The real sentence. She sounded irritated now. "Maya." "No," I interrupted. "You want what protects your version of this family, and I don't fit inside it cleanly enough for you." "That's absurd." "Then why does this matter so much to you?" Silence again. Longer this time. And then Eleanor said something that made my entire body go cold. "Because Daniel deserves the truth before it's too late." Too late. Not before he gets hurt. Not before the family suffers. Too late. As though there were consequences already approaching. I tightened my grip on the phone. What does that mean? But Eleanor had already recovered herself. "I think emotions are making this conversation unhealthy." Classic exit strategy. She had revealed too much. "Eleanor? I truly hope the test gives everyone peace." Then she hung up. I stood motionless in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the dead silence on the line. Peace. Again that word. Everyone in this family kept talking about peace while quietly constructing war around me. And suddenly, for the first time since all this started, a terrifying possibility entered my mind. What if Eleanor wasn't inventing suspicion? What if someone had given it to her? That night, I didn't tell Daniel about the phone call. Not immediately. Part of me wanted to walk straight into our bedroom, turn on every light, and force the entire ugly truth into the open all at once. But another part, the calmer part, the part that had survived Eleanor for 7 years, understood something dangerous now. I was finally seeing pieces of a conversation that had been happening around me long before I realized I was part of it. And if I moved too quickly, they would close ranks again. So instead, I watched. Daniel came home just after 7, carrying Thai takeout and looking exhausted in the polished corporate way wealthy men often do. His tie loosened. Expensive coat damp from rain. Phone still in his hand even while stepping through the apartment door. For a brief second, watching him kneel beside Noah in the living room while our son excitedly showed him a paper dinosaur from preschool, everything almost looked normal again. That was the hardest part. Not the cruelty, the normalcy surrounding it. People imagine betrayal as dramatic, explosive, easy to identify. But most betrayal happens while someone reheats dinner, or folds laundry, or asks if you remembered to pay the electricity bill. The world almost never pauses for emotional devastation. "Look, Daddy!" Noah shouted proudly, holding up the crooked green dinosaur. "Mrs. Keller said mine was the best one." Daniel smiled immediately. "That's because you're secretly a genius." Noah laughed so hard he nearly fell backward off the couch. And suddenly my chest hurt, because whatever else was happening, Daniel genuinely loved our son. I knew that, which made everything worse. During dinner, I barely spoke. Not intentionally. I simply couldn't stop replaying Eleanor's sentence in my head. The timeline never made sense. Timeline. Not appearance. Not genetics. Timeline. Daniel noticed my silence halfway through the meal. "You okay?" I looked up from my untouched noodles. "Fine." That single word sat between us heavily. Noah, thankfully, remained distracted describing preschool drama involving glue sticks and a boy named Trevor who apparently bit another child during art time. Normally I would have smiled. Tonight the story barely registered. After Noah went to bed, Daniel found me standing alone on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket against the cold night air. Rain had finally stopped, but the city still looked wet beneath the streetlights. Reflections shimmered across pavement below like broken glass. "You've been distant all day," he said quietly. I kept my eyes on the street below. "Your mother called me." I heard the shift in his breathing immediately. Tiny. But there. "What did she say?" "Interesting." Not, "Why did she call?" Not, "Are you okay?" "What did she say?" "She wanted peace." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Maya." She also mentioned the timeline. That got him. His entire body stiffened so quickly it almost looked painful. And suddenly every instinct inside me became absolutely certain. There was something he wasn't telling me. I turned slowly toward him. "What timeline, Daniel?" The city hummed quietly below us. Somewhere far down the street, a siren moved through traffic. Daniel leaned against the balcony railing without looking at me. "You're reading too much into this." "No," I replied softly. "I think I've been reading too little into it for years." Silence again. Then finally, "My mother thought the pregnancy happened too fast." I stared at him. "That's it? She grew up differently. There are entire generations of women who managed not to accuse people of adultery because of a wedding date. She didn't accuse—" "Stop doing that." This time, my voice cut through the air sharply enough that even Daniel looked startled. "Every single time we get close to the truth, you hide behind technicalities." She implied, she suggested, she worried, she wondered. I shook my head slowly. "You know what emotionally intelligent people do when they want to avoid responsibility? They replace accusations with atmosphere." Daniel looked away immediately, and that reaction terrified me more than denial would have. "You don't understand my mother." "No," I whispered. "I understand her perfectly now. I just don't understand you." That landed. I watched it land physically. His shoulders tightened. His face hardened slightly. For the first time since all this began, irritation finally broke through his calm exterior. "You think this has been easy for me?" I almost laughed from disbelief. "Easy for you?" "Yes," he snapped quietly. "Being trapped between the two of you every single day." The moment the words left his mouth, the air changed. Because there it was. The real truth. He genuinely believed this was mutual conflict. Two difficult women creating emotional pressure around him. Not one woman systematically destabilizing his wife while he stood nearby asking everyone to lower their voices. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself because suddenly the night felt freezing. "There shouldn't be sides here, Daniel." "You know what I mean." "No," I said calmly. "Actually, I don't think I do anymore." He rubbed his forehead hard. "I'm trying to hold this family together." Again, family. Always family. As though I existed slightly outside the definition. I looked at him carefully now. Really looked. And suddenly I saw exhaustion beneath everything else. Real exhaustion. Not guilt exactly. More like someone carrying tension for too long. Then a thought entered my mind so suddenly it physically made my stomach turn. "What did she say to you?" Daniel frowned. "What?" "Privately. Before all this." My voice remained calm, but I could feel my heartbeat climbing now. "What exactly did your mother tell you that made you even consider a DNA test?" For several seconds he said nothing, and silence, I had learned, was often more revealing than confession. "Daniel." He exhaled slowly through his nose. "She hired someone." The city noise disappeared. Not literally, but inside my body, everything went silent. "What?" "She hired a private investigator after our wedding." I felt my fingers tighten painfully around the blanket. Rainwater dripped rhythmically from somewhere above us. "When were you planning to tell me this?" "She was trying to protect me." The sentence hit me so hard I genuinely had to look away. Not because it hurt, because it revealed something monstrous. Even now, part of him still framed this as protection. "What did the investigator find?" Daniel hesitated. Too long. Then quietly. "There was a man." The world tilted, not emotionally, physically. I grabbed the balcony railing instinctively. "A man?" "He said you met someone for coffee several times before the wedding." And suddenly I knew exactly who he meant. Ethan. My college friend. Gay, engaged, living in Seattle now. I stared at my husband in absolute disbelief. "You thought I was having an affair with Ethan?" I didn't know what to think. "But you never asked me." Daniel looked ashamed for the first time all evening. "She got into my head." No, that wasn't strong enough. Eleanor hadn't gotten into his head. She had built a second reality inside it. And he had allowed her to. I looked out over the city lights while something cold and irreversible settled quietly into place inside me. The DNA test was no longer the real problem. The real problem was this. My husband had once believed a stranger with photographs over his own wife. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing fragments of the past rearranging themselves into something uglier. Eleanor smiling at our wedding. Daniel hesitating when I announced the pregnancy. The strange quietness during my baby shower whenever dates came up. Tiny moments I had dismissed because love trains people to ignore evidence that threatens stability. By 3 a.m, I was sitting alone in the kitchen with all the lights off except the one above the stove. The city outside looked cold and distant through the windows. Rain had started again sometime after midnight, streaking silver lines down the glass while the radiator clicked softly behind me. I wrapped both hands around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding. What if Daniel never fully trusted me? Not now. Not recently. Ever. The thought moved through me slowly and painfully, like something sharp sliding beneath skin. Because trust isn't measured during easy years. Trust reveals itself in moments when someone else offers suspicion, and Daniel had accepted suspicion far too easily. Around 4:30, I heard footsteps. Daniel appeared in the kitchen wearing grey sweatpants and exhaustion across his face. His hair looked messy from sleep, and for a brief second he resembled the man I had once felt safest beside in the world. That almost made it harder. He stopped when he saw me awake. "You haven't slept?" "No." He hesitated before walking toward the counter. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly between us while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Finally Daniel said quietly, "You're making this bigger than it was." I stared at him. Actually stared. And something inside me almost broke from disbelief. bigger than it was, as though his mother hiring a private investigator to follow me before our wedding was some minor misunderstanding that had simply grown emotionally inconvenient over time. She hired someone to investigate me. She was trying to protect me. You already said that. She thought. No. My voice remained calm. I'm no longer interested in what your mother thought. I'm interested in what you thought. Daniel looked away immediately. Again. Always that instinctive retreat from direct truth. I didn't know what to believe. The honesty of that sentence hit harder than any lie could have. For several seconds I genuinely couldn't speak. Not because I was emotional, because suddenly everything became clear. Every hesitation, every compromise, every time Eleanor crossed a line and Daniel focused on managing reactions instead of defending me. He had never fully dismissed the possibility that she might be right. And once suspicion enters a marriage, even quietly, it changes the architecture of love itself. I stood slowly from the table. When exactly did she tell you about the investigator? Daniel rubbed his face tiredly. Before the wedding. My heartbeat stopped. Not metaphorically, physically. For one terrifying second, I felt absolutely nothing inside my chest. You knew before we got married? Maya, you married me while secretly wondering if I was cheating on you? That's not fair. The phrase almost made me laugh. Fair. Again. People always reached for fairness when truth became unbearable. What part isn't fair? I whispered. The part where your mother stalked me? Or the part where you let her? I didn't let her. You married me without telling me. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. I walked toward the sink because suddenly standing still felt impossible. The kitchen tiles felt freezing beneath my bare feet. How long did this investigator follow me? A few weeks. And Ethan? Daniel looked uncomfortable immediately. What about him? He photographed me having coffee with a gay man, and somehow that became evidence I was unfaithful? He didn't know Ethan was gay. But you could have known if you'd asked me one question. Daniel's jaw tightened. I was confused. No, I replied quietly. You were weak. That landed brutally. I saw it in his face, because deep down he knew it too. Weakness doesn't always look aggressive. Sometimes weakness looks like silence, while someone else destroys your marriage for you. Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen island and pressed both hands against his eyes. You think this hasn't haunted me? The exhaustion in his voice sounded real now. Raw. I married you anyway. The sentence echoed through the kitchen strangely. Anyway, as though loving me had required overcoming evidence against me. I felt suddenly exhausted beyond language. You don't even hear yourself anymore. That's not what I meant. But it is what you said. Another silence. Then finally Daniel looked up at me with something close to desperation. The investigator didn't find anything. I stared at him coldly. That should have been the end of it. It was for me. No, I whispered. It wasn't. Because if it had ended for him, we would not be standing here now discussing DNA tests for our 4-year-old son. Something survived all these years. Something poisonous. Something planted carefully by Eleanor and quietly watered by Daniel's fear of confronting her. The rain intensified outside. Water rolled down the windows in distorted patterns beneath the city lights. And suddenly another thought entered my mind. A thought so sharp it made my stomach tighten instantly. What did the investigator actually tell your mother? Daniel frowned. What? You told me about Ethan. Fine. I crossed my arms tightly against myself now. But Eleanor doesn't care about emotional affairs. She cares about timelines, bloodlines, dates. I stared directly at him. So what exactly convinced her Noah might not be yours? For the first time all night, genuine panic crossed Daniel's face. Tiny, fast, but unmistakable, and that terrified me, because panic meant there was more. Daniel. He stood immediately. Maya, stop. No, I'm serious. So am I. He looked toward Noah's bedroom instinctively, lowering his voice. There are things you don't understand. Cold moved through my entire body. What things? Silence again. Then finally, my mother thought the wedding happened too quickly because... He swallowed hard. Because of the timing after your miscarriage. The room disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. Everything inside me went blank. I stared at him without breathing. Miscarriage. Noah's pregnancy had not been my first pregnancy, and only 4 people in the world knew that. Me, Daniel, my doctor, and my mother. I felt suddenly nauseous. You told Eleanor? Daniel closed his eyes. She overheard us once. I gripped the edge of the counter so hard my fingers hurt. The miscarriage had happened 2 months before our wedding. Early, painful, private. One of the worst nights of my life. I remembered bleeding alone in a hospital bathroom while Daniel held my coat outside the door because I had been too ashamed to let him see me crying, and Eleanor had somehow transformed that grief into evidence against me. Oh my God! She thought maybe the dates overlapped. I looked at him in horror. You let your mother calculate my pregnancies like forensic evidence? Maya? No. My voice cracked for the first time all night. No, don't say my name right now. Because suddenly I understood something unbearable. Eleanor had never seen me as a human being, only as a potential threat to her son's inheritance, reputation, and bloodline. And the most devastating part? Daniel had known that for years. The next 3 days passed in a silence so controlled it became frightening. Not screaming silence, not dramatic silence. The kind that settles quietly into a marriage when 2 people realize they are no longer arguing about a single event, but about the entire hidden structure beneath their life together. Daniel became painfully careful around me after that conversation in the kitchen. Too careful. The kind of carefulness people use around injured animals they're afraid might bite. He lowered his voice constantly. Asked if I needed anything. Offered to pick Noah up from preschool. Made coffee without being asked. Touched my shoulder cautiously when passing behind me as though testing whether physical closeness was still allowed. And every small kindness somehow made the betrayal feel worse, because now I could see the guilt underneath it. Thursday evening, I found him standing alone in Noah's bedroom long after bedtime, the small nightlight shaped like a moon cast pale blue shadows across the walls, while Noah slept curled beneath dinosaur blankets, one hand tucked beneath his cheek. Daniel stood near the window staring down at our son with an expression I couldn't immediately identify. Fear. It took me several seconds to realize it. Fear. He turned when he heard me in the doorway. He looks like you when he sleeps, I said quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he asked something that made cold move slowly through my body. Do you think we can survive this? Not. Can you forgive me? Not. Can we fix this? Survive this? As though something catastrophic had already begun. I leaned lightly against the doorframe. That depends. On what? Whether this is really about your mother. His face changed immediately, too quickly, and suddenly I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally reached the center of something he had been trying desperately to avoid. Daniel looked toward Noah instinctively before speaking. You're exhausted. That's not an answer. Maya? No. My voice remained soft because of Noah sleeping only a few feet away. You don't get to keep hiding inside vague language anymore. Not after everything I've learned. He rubbed both hands over his face slowly. The exhaustion in him no longer looked temporary. It looked structural, like someone who had been carrying pressure for years. Finally he whispered, There are things I should have told you before we got married. The room seemed to narrow around me. Outside the bedroom window, rainwater reflected across nearby buildings in shifting silver patterns, while traffic moved somewhere far below. I spoke carefully. "What things?" Daniel sat slowly on the edge of Noah's bed. For several seconds, he simply watched our son breathe. Then quietly, "My father had another family." The sentence landed strangely, not because it shocked me completely, because suddenly dozens of disconnected details inside the Whitmore family snapped violently into place. Eleanor's obsession with bloodlines, her obsession with legitimacy, the constant tension beneath family gatherings, Mark's distant relationship with his father before he died, even the way old photographs disappeared from the house whenever guests visited. I felt my heartbeat slow. How long did she know? All of it? Daniel gave a humorless smile. Almost 20 years. The room suddenly felt colder. And everyone knew? Eventually. I stared at him in disbelief. Your father had a second family for 20 years, and your mother stayed? Daniel looked down at his hands. She believed preserving the family mattered more than humiliation. There it was again. The Whitmore philosophy. Image above pain. Stability above truth. Appearances above emotional reality. I crossed my arms tightly. And this somehow became my problem? You don't understand what it did to her. No, I said quietly. I understand exactly what it did to her. What I don't understand is why she decided to punish me for it. Daniel looked exhausted now. She became obsessed with certainty after that. Certainty? She needed control. He glanced toward Noah again. After my father died, she started seeing betrayal everywhere. A long silence stretched between us. Then I asked the question sitting heavily inside my chest. Did she ever actually believe Noah wasn't yours? Daniel hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything before he even answered. She thought there was a possibility. I closed my eyes, not because it hurt anymore, because suddenly the emotional geometry of this family finally made sense. Eleanor had spent decades surviving humiliation by transforming paranoia into self-protection. And instead of healing from it, the family had organized itself around maintaining her emotional delusions. Everyone adapted. Everyone softened reality for her. Everyone translated cruelty into concern. Everyone protected Eleanor from consequences. Even now. Especially now. When your father cheated, I said slowly, did anyone tell your mother she was overreacting? Daniel looked confused. What? All these years everyone's been protecting her feelings because she was betrayed once. I stared directly at him. So why is my pain suddenly inconvenient? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there was no answer. The silence itself became the answer. I walked farther into the room now, lowering my voice even more. You know what the worst part is? Maya? The worst part isn't Eleanor. I looked at Noah sleeping peacefully between us. It's that somewhere along the way, you learned her paranoia mattered more than my dignity. Daniel looked physically ill now. That's not true. Then why am I the one being investigated? Tested? Examined? My voice trembled for the first time in days. Why am I the one expected to absorb humiliation so your mother can feel emotionally safe? She's traumatized. And now I am too. That finally broke something in him. I saw it happen. Daniel stood abruptly and walked toward the window, pressing one hand against the glass. For several seconds he said nothing. Then quietly, the investigator found something else. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. Slowly, carefully, I asked, "What?" Daniel didn't turn around. He said he saw you outside a medical building. Confusion moved through me first, then realization. The fertility clinic. I stared at his back in disbelief. My gynecologist's office? He didn't know that. And you never asked me? I tried to. No, I whispered. You tried to quietly doubt me. The city lights reflected across the wet glass in fractured patterns around him. Daniel finally turned toward me. She convinced me there were things I didn't know about you. I felt suddenly exhausted beyond words. Marriage requires trust before certainty. I know. No, I said softly. I don't think you do. Another silence. Heavy. Then Daniel said something so quietly I almost missed it. She wanted me to postpone the wedding. Everything inside me froze. What? My mother. The room tilted emotionally. When? The week before the ceremony. I stared at him in horror. And you still married me without telling me? She said if I delayed things, the truth would eventually come out. Truth. Again that word. Always truth. As though my entire existence inside this family had been treated like an unsolved crime scene from the very beginning. And suddenly, one devastating realization entered my mind. This marriage had not started with trust damaged. It had started with trust already contaminated. The DNA test happened the following Monday. Eleanor insisted on hosting it at her house. Of course she did. Everything important in the Whitmore family had to happen on territory she controlled. The morning itself felt unnaturally bright after nearly 2 straight weeks of rain. Sunlight poured across the city in sharp, golden reflections, while cold wind moved through the streets hard enough to rattle tree branches against nearby buildings. I remember thinking the weather felt wrong for what was about to happen. Too beautiful, too clean, as though the world itself had refused to acknowledge the ugliness waiting inside that house. Daniel barely spoke during the drive. One hand rested tightly on the steering wheel, while the other tapped nervously against his leg every few seconds. Noah sat in the back seat talking happily about a science project involving butterflies, while completely unaware that 3 adults were quietly dismantling the emotional foundation of his family around him. I watched the city pass through the window in silence. Something inside me had changed over the past week. The grief was still there, the betrayal too, but beneath both now existed something colder, clarity, and clarity can become dangerous once fear disappears. When we arrived, Eleanor herself opened the door before we even reached it. She wore cream-coloured cashmere and pearl earrings, despite the fact that no guests beyond immediate family were present. Her silver hair sat perfectly in place. The house behind her smelled faintly of lilies and expensive furniture polish. Prepared, controlled, ceremonial. For one strange second, it felt less like arriving for a DNA test and more like entering a courtroom. Noah, sweetheart, Eleanor said warmly, kneeling to kiss his cheek. I have chocolate cake waiting for you. Noah brightened instantly and disappeared toward the kitchen. Children move naturally toward warmth, even when adults weaponize it. Eleanor stood slowly and looked at me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled faintly. I'm glad you agreed to do this. The sentence settled between us heavily, not because of the words, because of the satisfaction beneath them. I removed my coat carefully. No, I said calmly. You're relieved. Something flickered briefly behind her eyes. Tiny, fast, but real. Daniel immediately stepped between us, emotionally, if not physically. Can we please just get through today without fighting? Again. Fighting. As though mutual hostility existed here instead of years of carefully directed cruelty. Eleanor sighed softly. I never wanted conflict. I looked directly at her. You hired a private investigator before my wedding. For the first time since arriving, genuine discomfort crossed her face. Only for a second. Then composure returned immediately. I was protecting my family. There it was again. Protection. The elegant word wealthy people use when they want cruelty to sound responsible. We moved into the sitting room where a private medical technician had already set up equipment near the windows. A woman in navy scrubs stood beside a small case, organizing paperwork, while clearly trying not to absorb the emotional atmosphere around her. Mark was there too, leaning near the fireplace with a whiskey glass in his hand, despite it not yet being noon. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "Jesus Christ," he muttered quietly when he saw me. "We're really doing this." Eleanor ignored him completely. The technician smiled professionally. "I'll just need signatures first." The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Daniel signed immediately, too quickly, as though getting through the paperwork fast might somehow reduce the emotional reality of what we were doing. When the clipboard reached me, I stared down at the form for several seconds. Paternity verification authorization. Such clinical language for something capable of destroying people. My hands remained perfectly steady as I signed, but inside, something irreversible was hardening quietly into place. The technician explained the process gently, while Noah sat at the dining table eating cake and swinging his legs beneath the chair, blissfully unaware that his existence was being treated like disputed evidence. I watched him laugh at something Mark said, and suddenly felt almost detached from the room, like I was observing another woman's marriage collapse from very far away. Then Eleanor spoke. "Once this is settled, perhaps everyone can finally move on." The technician awkwardly looked down at her paperwork. Mark closed his eyes briefly, and something inside me finally snapped. Not emotionally, strategically. I turned slowly toward Eleanor. "No," I said calmly. "We won't." The room went still. Daniel looked at me immediately. "Maya?" "No." My voice remained controlled. "Because if this test proves Noah is Daniel's son, which it will, then we are going to discuss why this happened in the first place." Eleanor's posture stiffened slightly. "I think today should remain focused on the child." Interesting. Now she wanted limits. Now she wanted emotional boundaries. "You involved my child the moment you questioned his father." "Maya?" Daniel warned softly, but I continued looking directly at Eleanor. "You spent years investigating me behind my back." "I had reason." The room froze. Even the technician looked up now. I tilted my head slightly. "What reason?" Eleanor hesitated. For the first time since I'd known her, I saw uncertainty enter her expression publicly. "You moved very quickly into this family." "There it is," Mark muttered quietly from the fireplace. Eleanor ignored him. "You became pregnant almost immediately." "And?" Her eyes moved toward Daniel briefly before returning to me. "And women sometimes hide things." The sentence landed softly, but beneath it sat decades of bitterness, humiliation, paranoia, and class prejudice compressed into one elegant accusation. I smiled then, actually smiled, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. "You know what's fascinating?" I asked quietly. "You keep describing your own life while pretending you're describing mine." The colour drained slightly from Eleanor's face. Daniel stepped forward instantly. "Maya, enough." "No." I looked directly at him now. "Your father cheated for 20 years. Your mother turned paranoia into personality. And somehow all of you decided I should carry the emotional consequences of both." "That's unfair," Eleanor whispered. "Again, unfair. Always unfair. Never untrue." I laughed softly under my breath. "You know the worst part?" I said. "If your husband had trusted you the way mine trusted your suspicion, your entire life would have looked very different." That hit, brutally. Eleanor physically flinched, tiny but visible. Daniel looked horrified now. "Maya, stop." But something had shifted permanently inside me. Years of politeness, years of restraint, years of absorbing humiliation to preserve comfort. Gone. "I spent 7 years trying to make you love me," I said quietly to Eleanor. "And all along you were collecting evidence against me, like I was some criminal who slipped past security. "You don't understand what betrayal does to a woman." "No," I replied softly. "I understand exactly what it does. I just chose not to become cruel because of it." Silence exploded through the room. Even Noah looked up from the dining table now, confused by the sudden emotional change in the air. And then the technician cleared her throat gently. "I actually have the preliminary verification ready." Too fast. The room froze completely. Daniel turned pale instantly. Eleanor stood perfectly motionless. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. None of us were actually prepared to hear the result anymore. The technician looked uncomfortable the moment all eyes turned toward her. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, clutching the folder against her chest. "The lab processed the rapid verification faster than expected." Nobody moved. The entire room had become unnaturally still. Even Noah seemed to sense something changing beneath the surface of the adults around him. He had stopped eating cake and now sat quietly at the dining table, swinging his legs beneath the chair, much slower than before. Daniel's face looked pale enough to disappear into the sunlight pouring through the windows. Eleanor remained perfectly upright near the fireplace, controlled, elegant, but I noticed her fingers tightening once around the stem of her water glass. Tiny cracks. Finally, the technician cleared her throat softly. "The results confirm with 99.9% certainty that Daniel Whitmore is the biological father of Noah Whitmore." Silence. No dramatic gasp. No explosion. Just silence. The kind that arrives when people lose the right to pretend anymore. Daniel closed his eyes immediately. I watched relief hit him first, then shame. Deep. Crushing. Mark let out a breath under his nose and muttered, "For God's sake!" Across the room, Eleanor didn't move at all. At first I almost admired it. The discipline. The refusal to visibly collapse. But then I realized something far sadder. She had spent so many years controlling herself emotionally that even humiliation had nowhere left to go inside her. The technician offered the folder awkwardly toward Daniel. "I'll leave copies here for your records." No one reached for them. The room smelled faintly of coffee, sugar, lilies, and emotional ruin. Noah looked between us uncertainly. "Daddy?" Daniel immediately turned toward him. "It's okay, buddy." But his voice sounded wrong, fragile, like someone speaking through internal damage. Noah frowned slightly. Children always know when adults are lying emotionally. I walked slowly toward the dining table and knelt beside him. "Hey." I brushed frosting gently from the corner of his mouth with my thumb. "Why don't you go upstairs and look for the Lego box Grandma bought you?" His face brightened instantly. "Can I build in the guest room?" "Of course." He ran upstairs seconds later, small footsteps echoing softly across the polished staircase before disappearing completely. And then the house became truly quiet. Noah's absence changed everything. Now only adults remained. Adults and consequences. I stood slowly. Daniel looked at me first. "Maya?" I raised one hand gently, not angry, just finished. "No," I said quietly. "Please don't speak yet." Something in my voice made him stop immediately. I turned toward Eleanor. For several seconds we simply looked at each other across the room. 7 years. 7 years of holidays, birthdays, careful conversations, tiny humiliations disguised as etiquette. Every moment suddenly visible for what it truly was. And strangely enough, I no longer felt angry. That surprised me most, because anger requires hope underneath it. Hope that another person could have chosen differently. But standing there in Eleanor's house, I finally understood something devastating. This woman had built her entire identity around surviving betrayal, and somewhere along the way, survival had slowly transformed into cruelty. "You were wrong," I said softly. Eleanor swallowed once, barely noticeable. "Yes," she replied quietly. No excuse, no performance, just yes. And somehow that hurt more. Daniel looked stunned beside her, as though hearing his mother admit fault out loud violated the laws of physics. I kept my eyes on Eleanor. You investigated me before my wedding. She nodded once. You questioned my son's identity for years. Another nod. You turned my miscarriage into evidence against me. At that, something finally cracked visibly across her face. Pain. Real pain. Not theatrical, but still not enough. I thought I was protecting him, she whispered. There it was again. Protecting him. I almost smiled sadly. You know what's tragic? I said quietly. You spent so much time protecting your son from imaginary betrayal that you helped him betray the one person who actually loved him. Daniel physically flinched. The words hit exactly where they were supposed to. Eleanor looked suddenly older. Not physically, spiritually, like the weight of years had finally become visible all at once. I lost my husband slowly, she said after a long silence. Long before I lost him officially. Her voice sounded distant now. You don't understand what suspicion does to a woman. I looked at her carefully. No, I replied softly. I understand perfectly. And I did. That was the unbearable part. I understood her so well it frightened me, because pain, left untreated long enough, eventually starts searching for new homes to live inside. Eleanor had simply chosen mine. Daniel stepped toward me carefully. Maya, please. I finally looked at him, and for a second I saw every version of him at once. The man I married, the frightened son, the weak husband, the loving father, the exhausted mediator, all of them real, all of them incomplete. Tears stood in his eyes now, though he still seemed incapable of fully letting them fall. I love you, he whispered. The sentence moved through the room gently, and years ago it would have been enough. That was the tragedy. Love had existed here. Real love. Just not strong enough to survive fear. I held his gaze quietly. I know. His face broke then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but visibly. And I realized in that moment that Daniel had spent his entire life trying to prevent emotional disaster instead of confronting truth directly. That was how Eleanor shaped people. She taught them peace mattered more than honesty. Silence mattered more than dignity. Comfort mattered more than trust. And suddenly I knew with absolute certainty that I could not raise Noah inside that inheritance. I'm taking Noah home tonight, I said softly. Daniel inhaled sharply. Maya, I'm not leaving forever. My voice remained calm. But things cannot continue the way they were. Eleanor lowered her eyes for the first time since I had known her. Mark quietly walked toward the window, giving us privacy without actually leaving. The afternoon sunlight had started fading now, stretching long golden shadows across the room. Everything looked strangely beautiful, despite the devastation sitting inside it. Daniel spoke carefully. What happens now? Such a simple question, and yet the entire future sat inside it. I looked toward the staircase where Noah's laughter faintly echoed from upstairs, then back at Daniel. Now, I said quietly, you decide whether you want to spend the rest of your life being your mother's son. I paused. Or Noah's father. The silence after that felt enormous, because everyone in the room understood what I was really asking. Not about the DNA test, about courage. Daniel stared at me like someone seeing his own reflection clearly for the first time. And for once, nobody rushed to rescue him from the discomfort of truth. I picked up my coat slowly. Outside the windows, the sun had finally begun setting behind the city skyline, washing everything in soft amber light. Beautiful endings always look gentler from a distance. Before turning toward the door, I looked once more at Eleanor. You were right about one thing, I said softly. Her eyes lifted toward mine. Secrets do destroy families, Then I walked upstairs to get my son. The drive home happened in silence. Not angry silence. Not even wounded silence anymore. Just exhaustion. The kind that settles over people after something irreversible finally reveals itself in full daylight. Noah fell asleep 20 minutes into the drive, his small head leaning against the car seat beneath the soft glow of passing streetlights. One of his tiny sneakers had slipped halfway off his foot. Every now and then, the car moved over a bump gently enough to make him sigh in his sleep. I kept turning around to look at him, not because I was worried, because suddenly he felt unbearably precious. Children trust so completely. They enter rooms smiling before understanding what adults are capable of doing to one another inside them. Daniel drove with both hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He hadn't tried speaking again after we left Eleanor's house. For once, he seemed to understand that apologies arriving too early often serve the person speaking more than the person hurt. The city outside moved in blurred gold and white streaks across the rain-damp windows, and somewhere between one traffic light and the next, I realized something strange. I no longer felt desperate to save my marriage. That realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt calm, not because I had stopped loving Daniel, but because love without safety eventually becomes grief. When we finally reached the apartment building, Daniel quietly carried Noah upstairs, while I followed behind them slowly through the hallway. Everything felt surreal in the soft yellow lighting of the corridor. Normal neighbors, normal doors, normal lives continuing uninterrupted while ours had quietly cracked open. Inside the apartment, Daniel laid Noah carefully in bed without waking him. I stood in the doorway watching as he pulled the dinosaur blanket gently over our son's shoulders. For a moment, he simply remained there looking down at him, and suddenly I saw it. The full weight of what had happened finally reaching him emotionally. Not the DNA result. Not Eleanor. Not even me. Noah. Because one day our son would grow up enough to understand this story. And children never forget the moment they realize adults fail to protect them from unnecessary pain. Daniel brushed trembling fingers through Noah's hair once before quietly leaving the room. He found me standing in the kitchen afterward. Neither of us turned on the overhead light. Only the city glow from the windows illuminated the apartment in pale silver shadows. For a while, we said nothing. Then finally Daniel spoke. "I don't know how to fix this." His voice sounded destroyed, not performative, not dramatic, just honest. I leaned lightly against the counter. "You can't fix 7 years in one night." He lowered his eyes immediately. "I should have protected you." There it was. The sentence I had needed all along. Not excuses, not explanations, recognition. I nodded once slowly. "Yes," I said quietly. "You should have." The truth sat heavily between us, but strangely, it no longer felt violent, only sad. Daniel pressed both hands against the kitchen island and stared down at the marble surface like a man trying to physically hold himself together. "She manipulated me." I watched him carefully. "No," I replied softly. "She manipulated your fear. That's different." The words visibly hurt him, but they were true. Fear had always existed before Eleanor used it. Fear of conflict. Fear of disappointing her. Fear of choosing someone else over the emotional gravity of his family. And fear, left unchallenged long enough, eventually becomes character. "I thought keeping peace mattered," he whispered. "That's because you grew up watching people confuse silence with love." His eyes finally lifted toward mine, red, exhausted. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know, and I did know. That was what made everything tragic instead of simple. Cruel people are easy to leave. Broken people are harder, especially when they love you sincerely while still failing you completely." The radiator clicked softly somewhere behind us. Outside, rain had started again, gentle this time, almost delicate against the windows. Daniel swallowed hard. "Are you leaving me?" Such a small sentence, yet the entire room seemed to hold its breath around it. I looked toward the hallway leading to Noah's room, then back at my husband. "I think," I said slowly, "we've spent years pretending trust survived things it actually didn't." Daniel closed his eyes. Pain crossed his face openly now. No defense left. No strategy. Just grief. "I love you," he whispered again. This time the words sounded less like persuasion and more like mourning. I walked toward the window slowly. The city stretched endlessly outside beneath rain and light, and thousands of strangers carrying invisible heartbreaks through their own apartments tonight. And suddenly, I understood something important. Families are not destroyed in one dramatic moment. They erode quietly, through tolerated disrespect, through unanswered cruelty, through the slow normalization of pain. I rested one hand lightly against the cold glass. "When Noah grows up," I said softly, "I never want him to think love means staying silent while someone humiliates the person beside you." Daniel began crying then, quietly, the way adults cry when they've spent their entire lives trying not to. I turned back toward him, and despite everything, part of me still loved him enough to hurt for him too. That was the final cruelty of real love. It rarely disappears exactly when it should. "I don't hate you," I whispered. Daniel covered his face with one hand. The relief and devastation that moved through him simultaneously almost made it difficult to breathe. "But things have to change now." He nodded slowly without looking up. For several minutes, neither of us spoke again. The apartment remained dim and quiet, except for rain tapping softly against the windows and Noah turning gently in his sleep down the hallway. Then Daniel finally asked, "What happens tomorrow?" I looked toward the dark reflection of our lives in the glass. Tomorrow. Such an ordinary word for something capable of changing everything. "We start telling the truth," I said quietly, and for the first time since this began, the silence that followed no longer felt like fear.